Thank you for joining us for our May lecture on this beautiful night. My name is the Three Village Historical Society. Hello to everyone has a hybrid now, and they'll slowly start to trickle in. And right now it says my internet connection is unstable. So sorry to everyone at home. I hope that you can hear us and see us clearly. And I'm going to ask everyone to keep your mics on mute and hold your questions or comments till the very end, where you can type in your questions in the chat feature, and then we will we'll say them in the room. Okay, we have summer ahead at the Three Village Historical Society, beginning with this week. We're starting our annual awards dinner, one that we have not hosted since the beginning or since before the pandemic. So we're really excited that that's coming back. That's on Wednesday. If anyone's interested in joining us at that, you can talk to us after the event, or you can visit us online. And you can purchase tickets there. We are launching a new book club this summer. Some more information will be on our website about that as well. This Saturday, we're hosting a yard sale at the Historical Society from 9 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. And that's at 90 Talkit. We have close to 40 vendors that will be there selling their goods. Some might call it junk, but but we're excited to see what everyone's bringing to the society. So I hope that you'll join us for that. Right after that, on the following week, May 26th, is opening day of our farmers market, and our is wearing our farmers market t-shirt. He's really good at advertising for us. So if anyone else is interested in a t-shirt, we have it in 3 colors. It's at the Historical Society. We hope that you'll come by and visit us. It's from 3 to 7, and it'll be every single Friday until October, so for the whole season. Some more exciting news: we hired some new people at the Historical Society, one of which is our new collections coordinator, Scott Ferrara. So for everyone that has some archival research needs, you can finally send your request in to them. So we're really excited about that. And more events. We have Tea with a Spot of History that's back. We have lectures lined up for every single month throughout the end of the year. And when you first walked in at the table, there was this upcoming events and a little QR code. Every month we put one of these out, and with your phone, if you just scan the QR code, it'll take you directly to our website with the full list of events for the entire year. Okay. Now, Ann Becker is a professor of historical studies at SUNY Empire State College and received her American history from Stony Brook University. Areas of interest include the American Revolution, with a focus on the military and societal impacts of smallpox, as well as Revolutionary War. Her book, Smallpox in Washington's Army, Disease, War, and Society During the Revolutionary War, was published in December 2022. We unfortunately do not carry it yet in our gift shop, but if you're interested in purchasing a copy, I strongly suggest that you speak with Ann at the end of the presentation. She has presented at numerous academic conferences and published several articles in scholarly journals. And we're honored to welcome Dr. Becker to our lecture tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate that. And a slight editorial. We are Empire State University now. As you know, that's the trend. Everybody's a university, so we are too. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. So smallpox in Washington's Army, disease, war, and society during the Revolutionary War. Oh no. Not moving. Oh no.
Before we couldn't get it to stop.
We couldn't get it to stop moving. Oh boy.
Let's see, maybe oh.
Okay, we just have to wait. No, it's probably.
I think, yeah.
Okay, keep our fingers crossed. We're hoping this is a smooth presentation. Okay, so smallpox, if you don't know or know, is a dreadful, horrible disease. known as the most terrible of all ministers of death across the Atlantic world in the 18th century, particularly in the North American colonies, because there was very little immunity to the disease. It was universally feared throughout North America. It was known for the grotesque torture of its victims, the brutality or lethal or disfiguring outcomes, and the terror that it inspired. And that's an important aspect of it. People were very afraid, and having just come out of the COVID pandemic, we all you don't want to get something that you know is going to be deadly or horrible disease. It was really a perpetual threat to public health before and during the 18th century. There were different methods that were used to control the disease, as you can see there, similar to what we went through: quarantine, isolation, avoiding people that you think might be on. The symptoms themselves were very distinctive and horrible, actually: headaches, backache, high fever, vomiting, anxiety, ultimately that rash and the outbreak of the pox. And I do have a picture later. It's not too gruesome, so I didn't want to, really get anybody sick over it, but it is pretty horrible. If you Google the images of it, very, very ugly disease to have to suffer through. You could get separate pox, more like chicken pox. Some of us of a certain age may have had chicken pox, or our children had chicken pox. But the confluent smallpox would be like oozing mass, like all over your whole body, very uncomfortable. And it actually kind of starts from the inside out. So you get it in your mouth and your nose and different places before it even breaks in. Very debilitating. It could have long-term consequences. Of course, it was deadly in many cases, and you would have horrible scarring and, just a really, really miserable thing. And again, of contracting the disease and living with or dying because of these complications was something that really affected people. So we have a little delay here, so should clear up in a second. Sorry.
Yeah, it's so odd. Oh,
Just maybe just give it a quick touch. Okay. Okay, go back one. Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so preventing the infection, again, was paramount for people. Stay away from people if you knew they were sick. If you heard a family had smallpox, stay away from them. Basically, in the early part of the 17th and 18th centuries, they didn't really know about inoculation, which is a form of vaccination, but you actually give yourself the disease, hopefully a mild case, and then you end up with lifelong immunity. Fatality rate for inoculated smallpox was much lower. So this was something that people, were happy to learn about, but were also a little concerned about it. Again, think about giving yourself COVID, like going out and saying, I'm just getting COVID, so I never have to worry about getting COVID. It's counterintuitive. The process of inoculation was first introduced in America by Dr. Zabdiel Boylston and Reverend Cotton Mather during the 1721 Boston epidemic. And it was a little counterintuitive, as I said, and controversial. But you can see from the image there, the worst is the regular natural acquired smallpox. Inoculated smallpox is very small, very contained, much less debilitating. So our revolutionary leaders were obviously very aware of smallpox, particularly General Washington. He himself suffered a case of smallpox when he was only 19 years old, when he was traveling in Barbados. Infertility is actually a documented side effect of smallpox, and we're pretty sure George Washington never had natural children of his own, so that could be one side effect that he was maybe not even aware of. That was pretty, life-changing for him. He did get lifelong immunity as a result of that case that he had at age 19. And his responsibilities as a plantation owner and military commander, provided a lot of expertise for him in dealing with people who and so on. His wife, Martha, was inoculated, even though I was extremely frightened to make myself sick now. And her son, Jackie, who was in the army at the time, was inoculated without her knowledge, and Washington decided, I'm just gonna do it. He needs to have this done, and I'm not gonna tell her until it's all over and he's okay, and that's what he did. John Adams was a proponent. He in 1764, and his wife and family, a little bit of the because of the fear of spreading it. So if you inoculate yourself, you're protected, but if you're not really vigilant about quarantining yourself, you could spread it to someone else, and then it spreads and spreads and spreads. So it was typically illegal in most colonies unless there was an epidemic threatening, and then the colonial say, okay, we're going to be able to do it, but they would strictly did it early on. Abigail, they were engaged at the time. Her father wouldn't let her do it, so she couldn't do it. But in 1776, as we'll learn a little later, after the siege of Boston, and the British left, everybody was inoculating because smallpox was everywhere in the city. Benjamin Franklin, again, a strong proponent. Yes.
Didn't Benjamin Franklin oppose it first?
There was a lot of controversy in Boston in 1721. Franklin may well have, presented it, and so he was pretty, well, I don't know how old he was. But he had a tragic family circumstance where he had a young son, age 4. He was planning to have him inoculated. The child became ill with something else, and they waited, and then young Frankie ended up getting it naturally and died. So it was a lifelong regret of Franklin, but he always was a strong proponent of it. Who else do I have here? Abigail. Okay, so that's everybody. The risk versus the benefit, of course, finding out that smallpox was around could create panic. If you were anticipating being exposed to it, you wanted to be inoculated to protect yourself and remove that constant dread of fear of, am I going to get it? Am I not? Is my family going to get it? But still dangerous to introduce it into a community. And most people early on preferred to reduce the danger with simply notification and quarantine regulations, inoculation when absolutely necessary. So now we're into the war a little bit. So the British and the double-edged sword of smallpox. The British had a different situation because in most of Europe, probably all of Europe, being that a lot of people lived in big cities, the disease was endemic, meaning that almost everybody caught it at a young age, as we know with measles, mumps, chickenpox. Kids get it, they get over it, they never have to worry about it again. So it was almost always present with the British troops. And as we know, the troops were coming here, starting in 1760. During the French and Indian War, the British were here. They were experiencing some issues with smallpox. We've probably heard about the situation where they tried to infect the native population. Been pretty well proven that they at least intended to do it. Whether they actually were successful is kind of hard to find the real documentary evidence of. But General Amherst, the Amherst affair, he wanted to, he thought this was a good military tactic to weaken his enemy. Oh, go back one. Okay. So the war, it begins 1775. Down in the South, we had Lord Dunmore. He makes a proclamation encouraging slaves to leave the plantations, come join the British. It sets out specifically all indentured servants, Negroes or others appertaining to rebels would be free that are able and willing to bear arms for the British as soon as may be for the more speedily reducing the colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. So Dunmore's idea was, this is a rebellion, we got to stop it. We're going to use every effort. We're going to enlist the slaves, hurt the colonials two ways: one, to deprive them of their property, slaves and workforce, and help us fight them. Didn't work out the way he wanted to, predominantly because of smallpox. Very early in the war in January of '76, slaves that were attracted to the British Army and the Southern Loyalists were pretty vulnerable. Again, colonials, they were not, and so they were becoming very ill very quickly. And a lot of blacks from, later future president James Madison said, quote, "If America and Britain should come to a hostile rupture, an insurrection among the slaves may and will be promoted," which was the case. Large number of blacks did by fighting and mainly supporting in labor and menial jobs. They died, and they weren't quite as willing to join because they knew that they could likely become very ill as well, having no immunity to the disease. Again, a quote from a soldier: "By the smallpox and other malignant disorders, it is clear the British have lost since their arrival at Wynn's Island nearly 500 souls, and soldiers, American soldiers, were shocked with horror at the number of dead bodies strewed about 2 miles along the beach." So the British, were really taking advantage of the desire of the slaves to become free, and they weren't really taking care of them. They weren't inoculating them, they weren't quarantining them, they would just come and help us, and if you get sick, well, that's just basically too bad. At Boston now, so we're kind of traveling a little bit between time and space here. So now we're back up at Boston. Siege is beginning. Washington, arrives soon, but appointed commander-in-chief before really things get underway, before there really is even a continental army. There were about 20,000 militia massed outside of Boston at Roxbury and Cambridge, and smallpox immediately became an issue. Again, with smallpox in the city with the British, there was constant moving back and forth. There were refugees, there were people trying to escape. And as we'll hear, the British were being accused of actually sending out victims that had been inoculated or otherwise came down with smallpox purposely to infect the Americans that were besieging the city. So Gage had cut off all communications. He shut up any avenue of communication or travel by land and water. Washington arrives of the danger that his troops are in the existence of smallpox in the city. And this is actually one of the topic was, I was thinking about the revolution, smallpox and war and disease. And I said, let me go to Washington's letters. I went to his letters and bang, almost every other letter as he was outside Boston had to do with the health of the troops, smallpox. How can we prevent smallpox? It was just a constant theme throughout the first several years of the war. So he was really concerned about it. We see he's arriving to command. In command was General Sir William Howe, was in command at Boston. But Washington really was able to and he generally, again, consistently concerning smallpox. He was worried about its impact. He knew that the population of soldiers he had in front of him were isolated. They had been rural populations. They had been isolated. Vulnerable to the disease. So he restricted camp access, checked his refugees, anybody coming out of the town, and he isolated his troops. Dr. Benjamin Rush later noted that epidemics generally did arise with the, quote, sudden assembling of a great number of persons together of different habits and manners, such as the soldiers of the American Army were in the year of 1776 and 1777. So initially felt they were safe, they're in the city. They have control over smallpox among their troops because they have been using inoculation. Many of the troops were already immune to smallpox. They had had it at a younger age. But remember, the British Army was well known for having many, many hundreds and thousands of camp followers, including wives, children, babies being born. So there were other vulnerable people within Boston, aside colonies, that could and did spread disease. And that's what Washington was really, really afraid of. When it,
Click this off, someone enabled closed captioning.
I'm sorry.
Oh, it's not you.
Okay. So as they were both armies, you know, doing their own thing to try to contain smallpox, Washington becomes aware that there are being refugees sent out of Boston purposely, as I said earlier, who had been inoculated and with the intent of getting the Americans sick. And Washington says, the information I received that the enemy intended could not suppose them. How now Gibson had, as it has made its appearance on several of those who last came out of Boston. So again, he's checking the refugees, he's watching them, he's quarantining them, and he's finding people sick with smallpox being sent or coming out of the city. So it's supposed to be shut up tight. So he doesn't like that. Come on, one more.
Everyone.
Okay. That. Let's try.
Internet is slow here.
Okay. Okay, so the siege has gone on for some time. Now we're in the spring. We know, I think most to get the cannon and coming down to fly. The siege is ended. The British decide they have no choice, they have to leave. But even after again, smallpox is rampant within the town, the city, he took precautions, General Washington. He ordered, quote, neither officer nor soldier should presume to go into Boston without leave, as the enemy with malicious assiduity through all parts of town. So he's aware that the situation is dangerous, and he selected only that they were probably marked from an earlier disease, which meant that they were immune and they couldn't catch it and they couldn't spread it. So he was careful. Earlier, this is when Abigail Adams and her family in July of 76, this had been gone since Smallpox is raging. This legislature lifted its ban on inoculation. As I said earlier, it was typically banned unless there was an emergency. This was an emergency, so could protect themselves. And this is when Mrs. Adams and her family were inoculated against the disease, along with almost everybody else in the city who hadn't already suffered through a case of it. So now we're going up to Canada. Again, some of these things are happening at the same time. So you can sort of see where, you know, Washington is being bombarded from all sides with problems with smallpox from one level to the next. The title of my chapter, Ruined with Smallpox, the Canadian Campaign, is basically what most people said after the fact. Congress was anxious to have a Canadian alliance. They wanted defense against possible British aggression, and to show, you know, we were going to become independent. It was inevitable, but the defeat was pretty awful, and it was primarily due to smallpox in Canada. So, and you to be familiar with the scenario, you have a march north, Montgomery's going up there, Arnold is marching north, going up to Quebec. to assault the city and attempt to convince, again, counterintuitive, convince the Canadians that you got to join us, because if not, we're going to, you know, fight you or something. So a little counterintuitive. But you had Benedict Arnold, and of course, General Carleton. When they get to Quebec, they get there in early December. They capture Montreal, they move on, they get to Quebec, they're outside Quebec, which is a walled, fortified city, not easy to attack. It's December. Enlistments are running out, and smallpox erupts in the American camps early in December. It's not likely that they had been exposed previously, because they were just marching through the woods, you know, the same group of people. So it's probably definite that they were infected somehow from either people coming in and out, or some communication with the people that were within Quebec. And again, the rumor and the supposition is that this is being done intentionally by the British. Smallpox was rampant in Quebec. It erupts among the Americans in December 6th. Again, Carleton supposedly ordered to send contagious victims into the American lines. The believability is because he had done so previously during the French and Indian War, as had other British officers, and it was going to reduce the capacity of the enemy to lay siege to Quebec. As discussed, the Patriot troops were very vulnerable, susceptible to catching the disease. They got ill almost immediately. They had no time to inoculate themselves because the process is very lengthy. You have to infect yourself, then you have to wait a few days, then you might start to get sick. Usually 3 or 4 weeks before you recover from the inoculation. And here they're looking at 2 days before we have to attack, or else, and everybody's getting sick. So they couldn't use inoculation, even though they were aware of its benefits. End of the year, the enlistments were expiring. So even though the officers were telling the soldiers, you can't inoculate, we don't have time, we just can't do it, they were actually self-inoculating, meaning that they knew it was a simple process. You just find somebody who had smallpox, you take some of the matter, the pus, you cut yourself, you put it in there, then you'll come up with that little, you know, spot that I showed earlier on your arm or on your leg or someplace hidden because you weren't supposed to be doing it. So they were hiding it. But what happens when you inoculate yourself in a camp? Quebec, where people are on each other, you have space, lack of flow, lack of ability to quarantine yourself, everybody's getting sick. So the soldiers quickly grasped this fact: either I inoculate myself or I'm probably going to be much sicker and more likely to die. So they're off. They couldn't control it at all. Ultimately, Montgomery makes the decision. He's forced to attack. He's killed during the attack. And then Benedict Arnold is left to attempt a siege of Quebec under pretty desperate conditions in the winter, lack of supplies. The disease is rampant among now his troops. You had the spiraling sequence of events where self-inoculation is introducing smallpox, then more people get sick, then everybody's afraid. And throughout this time, you had recruits coming in. As the recruits came in, they were quickly aware of what the situation was. We have to inoculate or else we're going to get this disease too. So it was just a really difficult time, and Arnold was just not able. I don't think anyone would have Benedict Arnold, but there was no way to control that situation. So the congressional leadership decides they're going to send somebody who knows what he's doing, Dr. General John Thomas. He's a medical doctor. He was highly successful in some of the fighting around Boston. He's sent up in the spring of '76. Now, the Americans they know the British are just waiting for reinforcements. Yes.
Sorry, where Where did John Thomas actually go? Did they go to England, Scotland?
I don't know, honestly, sorry, that I don't know.
I'm just, as an audience member, if you could just hold the question and tell us again, right, and that way we could all, if election came here, anybody who.
It's a good question though, but we can talk about that later. So he arrives, he's a medical doctor sent to command the Northern Army. He's not immune to smallpox. He refuses inoculation as a, example to his troops. He's not letting any of them inoculate. So he says, well, I can't either. He gets up there, gets smallpox within literally weeks and dies. Pretty horrifying of smallpox, blind, semi-conscious by June 2nd. So it just shows, that it was inevitable. You were going to get it under this situation. So the Army has no choice. They have to retreat. The reinforcements are arriving. The ships from England are coming and they're struggling to escape, right? Everybody's sick. They don't have the supplies that they need. It was just a real nightmare of a retreat. Very, very sad and very depressing for the leaders of the revolution, because there was just, they lost this one big time. John Adams, who was a proponent of inoculation, wrote afterwards, he said, I hope measures will be taken to cleanse the army from the by tolerating and encouraging to render that distemper less terrible. So again, he's aware it's a good thing to do, but you have to do it in a timely fashion and you have to have control over the situation. Otherwise, what happened in Canada could happen again. So ultimately, they start this thought process. All right, we can't have an army functioning like this, where we never know if they're going to, fight. If they're sick, then they're going to inoculate themselves. They start using supervised inoculations as they're retreating in July of 1776. And Adams again lays the defeat in Canada squarely upon the effects of smallpox. He says, quote, our misfortunes in Canada are enough to melt a heart of stone. The small times more terrible than Britain. So that's it. That's what caused the defeat there, in his mind anyway. So it was continuing to be a danger. Again, in Canada, he was still down in Boston, right, Long Island, after all nightmares going on up in Canada. Disobedience will be most severely punished, right? So they've learned a little bit of a lesson that they have to get control over this disease. They have to get control over this process of inoculation. So Washington's planning for the disease to break out happen as he prepares for his next military campaign. He's got hospitals, he's got quarantine and isolation regulations going on. The soldiers are really afraid now, and new recruits are very reluctant to join the army, predominantly because they're worried about smallpox. At this time, still, New York state law or New York colony law prohibited inoculation. So, he would have to use some kind of extraordinary means, get permission from the civil authorities and all of that to be able to do it. So he's worried. Doesn't turn out to be as much of a problem, because I think most of the troops with him, although they did get sick, they had probably either had smallpox already. They were the hardcore, Continental group, and not necessarily all new recruits. This is just a map of the battle of, where the battle was taking place. He did have issues with illness. Smallpox was a significant cause. A lot of his officers were medically unfit to fight on the Battle of Long Island. And he, of course, faced an invasion force of some 30,000 British troops. He had about 10,000 troops on duty, but only about maybe 6,000 or 7,000 effective and able to fight. And again, as we know, that battle did not go too well for General Washington. So we'll shift gears a little bit now to the situation in the prisons. Nothing but death before me, smallpox and Revolutionary War prisons. So a lot of the prisoners of war were seamen taken off privateer vessels. As we know, there really was no American Navy at that time. They were just kind of volunteers on privateers, sailing around harassing the British ships and so on. So they were captured and mostly held as prisoners. British turned this around and tried to use the terrible conditions with which they were holding these prisoners So they would literally say to the prisoner, "Well, if you will feed you, we'll give you a uniform, we'll give you a horse, well, you're good." Not too many took advantage of it, but they did suffer, and many American prisoners died. Something like 11,000 died in the prison ships, in the prison camps, and a lot of them were due to the effects of smallpox and other horrible diseases. Washington, of course, complained about this situation. He wrote to General Howe. He says they were offered better treatment, provided that they were enlist, and that's not fair, basically. And a prisoner on the Jersey prison ship wrote, "There is nothing but death or entering into the British service before me." So the recruiting officers would entice the prisoners. They would actually remove the American officers from their men so that they could, talk to the men by themselves and just convince them this is your only option. And it really was fear of the disease of smallpox and the threat conditions didn't take care of them. They purposely didn't feed them. I mean, they had a lot of supply chain issues and so on, but it was definitely something that they used to their advantage when they could. So this is of what it might have looked like down in the hull of the prison at Jersey. It was just, a horrible situation where, every day they would be bringing up a dozen men dead overnight, and they would just be burying them on the shore. And it was really a horrible situation. And smallpox, again, was something that you couldn't get away from it. Washington himself did believe that the British were mistreating the captives in order to destroy their health. If either force them to enlist or destroy their health to the point where they could never be healthy enough to serve, even if they were exchanged or returned to the American side. And there was a lot of corruption and graft in the British prison administration. They didn't offer inoculation. Some of the soldiers most likely did take advantage of that. They could inoculate themselves, but again, in the close, unhealthy, crowded conditions, if you inoculated yourself, you were going to spread that to your fellow prisoners as well. So finally, 1777, Washington has, he's had enough. He's seen it all. He says, we can't do this anymore. We have to protect our troops. And the only way to do that was to inoculate, everybody who signed up in the army. Doing so, of course, put him a little bit in danger, because if the British found out that he's, doing waves and waves of inoculation, his troops are sick for weeks and weeks at a time, it would be dangerous. The British could take advantage and try to attack. So he, asked for secrecy initially. And in the winter of 1777, January, February, he mandates inoculation for all Continental Army troops, and mass inoculations begin in spite of the tendency to spread the virus. And he writes, "The deplorable and melancholy situation to which one of our armies was reduced last campaign by the smallpox has determined me to introduce inoculation immediately." And he emphasized that it was of the greatest importance and had to have preference over other military objectives. It was nothing that he could do more important than protect his troops from terrible disease. So constant vigilance. He forces the soldiers, they had to be inoculated. I don't think any of them probably complained because they wanted to have it done anyway. Took every precaution to guard against subsequent epidemics. He isolated troops that were sick, those that were under inoculation, and the inoculation of any troops that were not immune to smallpox, and all recruits continued throughout the rest of the war, essentially. So after Saratoga, it was not an issue. Smallpox was not an issue up at Saratoga because that was right after this inoculation of the troops. And medical historian Oscar Reese wrote later, smallpox played no part in the watershed battle of the Revolution up at Saratoga. So Washington had effectively controlled the disease. All of his troops now were immune, and he didn't have to worry about a lot of things, but he didn't have to worry about an epidemic breaking out, as a surprise. So he could control that aspect of it. So it was no longer a dire threat to the health and safety of the soldiers. It didn't impact his military strategy because he had made different decisions throughout the war because of the danger of smallpox, or because troops were sick or didn't have enough troops and so on. So he was always taking care to protect any of the soldiers and or the followers from the disease. So smallpox on the road to Yorktown and beyond. So we think we're good now. He's all set, no problems. When the war moves south, you have the core Continental Army still up in the north. Some of them are down in the south with Nathaniel Greene and others. But you have a lot of volunteers, a lot of Southern patriots that are now volunteering to fight with the Americans, and you have loyalist militia. Fight with the British, as I had mentioned earlier, the Black militia, they were not immune to smallpox. So now you have a new theater of war, and you have smallpox erupting again because the troops that had been protected were protected, but they had new volunteers coming in all the time who were again susceptible to smallpox. So you always had to be aware of the situation, and it did impact the situation down in the South. In particular, the British were trying to recruit or capture slaves. They were successful in doing that. A lot of the slaves were flocking to the British, but same kind of conditions that they care them. They're not giving them food. They're not giving them any clothes to fight the war. And all of them were susceptible to smallpox, and the escaped slaves just followed the British. Women, children, they were following them, even if the British weren't giving them any support. They were still following them in the hope that eventually they would be able to be free. For the Americans, as I said, a lot of the volunteer militia troops just didn't want to fight. They didn't want to fight. They didn't want to be in a place where they were going to be susceptible to getting smallpox. In April of '78, there was an outbreak in Portsmouth, Virginia, and the Patriot militia refused to serve in the vicinity as they were, quote, under great apprehensions of danger from the smallpox, which has broken out at that post. South Carolina surrender of Charleston by General Benjamin Lincoln impacted his ability to defend the city. So Cornwallis is kind of cornered there. He died, particularly in the South with the formerly enslaved blacks who are succumbing to smallpox. Every day they're just constantly becoming sick and holding back what the British Army is trying to do. Ultimately, the Franco-American force does lay siege to the British at Yorktown, and in October of 1781, they win. However, when they come into Yorktown to see what was left, that's the picture of smallpox that I was going to show you. That's one of the least gross ones that I could find. But it's still pretty gross. The British garrison at Yorktown, many of the soldiers were sick, the former slaves were sick. It was just a real mess when the Americans finally, won the battle there. And again, Washington believed that the British were purposely introducing the disease. He's quoted as saying, "Our ungenerous enemy, having as usual propagated the smallpox in this part of the country." Somebody else wrote in the Pennsylvania Gazette, Lord Cornwallis's attempt to spread the smallpox among the inhabitants in the vicinity of York has been reduced. And must be so not a pleasant situation down in Yorktown. So the Americans don't really know yet that the war has been won due to the Battle of Yorktown, but yet the struggle against smallpox continues. It's still rampant as the enslaved blacks leave, or those who survive, in the most horrible situation. Somebody wrote, "Negroes lie about sick and dying in every state of the smallpox. Never was so filthy a place," when they actually went into the town to try to see what was going on in there. And of course, it spread with the troops, the militia, and any non-immune troops, soldiers returning to the north could be carrying that with them, and they did spread it amongst the civilian population. Washington continued his policies of inoculating anybody who was still susceptible, and it became really standard procedure, and ultimately references to smallpox in his letters, decline precipitously. He doesn't talk about it anymore. It's not really an issue. So the smallpox has been checked in its career. What I argue in the book is that it was really Washington's leadership that allowed inoculation to become sort of accepted as the only option and much more common across the colonies. He had this position as commander-in-chief. Civilian authorities were supporting him, allowed him to institute the widespread use of this effective, though dangerous, inoculation to control that deadly disease. Okay, so just by constantly working with the utmost vigilance against this most dangerous enemy, Washington succeeded in vanquishing smallpox within the Continental Army and protecting his troops against its devastating effect. So,
Something I was transmissible, was it only transmissible like skin or like tuberculosis you would pass?
it was highly contagious, coughing, touch, dried pustule, blankets,
Right.
letters. People were afraid to send letters if they had smallpox because they were afraid they could spread it that way. And like COVID, it was contagious before you had any symptoms. So, you could be percolating this disease within yourself and not realize it, and just, shake somebody's hand or cough and leave. Unlike COVID, where we were worried about wiping down our grocery bags for all that time, smallpox could be transferred that way. So yeah, it was very, very transmissible and very contagious. Yeah.
About the nurse locally and his effort to
He was, I don't know too many of his personal details, but I just know he, like a lot of doctors, supported inoculation. They knew this was a technique that worked. Not to mention they made quite a bit of money, sometimes charging for the procedure and so on. He was right in the middle of place. So talk it, sorry. Yeah, to quarantine his inoculees, the people that his patients, right? Because they knew it was important. You couldn't inoculate someone and then send them home because you couldn't trust that they would not then infect others and then like maybe even start an epidemic. So yeah, he was innovative, and a lot of doctors by this time by the Revolutionary War time. So between 1721 and 1760, becoming much more popular, and they had different techniques, they were safer, they had preparation that they would do, and so they were aware, but it was still coming up against that fear, like, I don't have it now, so why do I want to give it to myself, Yes.
Just to follow up on that, actually. So you mentioned it was illegal to work. I'm actually seeing a video where a foreign nurse is promoting this in hospitals here.
What year?
It was definitely before the revolution. So was there anything for having a hospital?
I haven't really done the research on the laws because it was sort of changing, New York might have been a little more flexible, but there was always control. There was always control, and it was never just flat out anybody who wants to do it can do it. So maybe you could get a hospital approved by the legislature because we think there's going to be a smallpox epidemic. So I wouldn't be surprised to see people advertising that because it was very popular, but Pennsylvania was more flexible about it. New England tended to be like, no, we don't want to do that up here. So yeah, that you had to follow the law, and the laws did shift and change. Yes.
From Western New Jersey, and
Oh.
something's because they never bought and take down to my house. And they talked about it. Now, this is a long time ago. That stayed in my mind how dangerous it was.
Yep.
They couldn't tell how live the virus was. So some people might get some would get full on. Is that true?
Yeah, if you know what you're doing and you have the availability of several victims, you're going to pick the guy who's got the least severe, and you're going to use the pus from him.
As in recovered or
As long as it was active, I guess, as long as it was active.
yeah.
But if you're desperate, you're going to use whatever you have. So medical doctors obviously have, a supply of it that you have. But if you're in the field in the army and, you're in a tent with 10 guys and somebody has it, you're not going to worry, well, is he going to die from it? You may not even know. But yes, you could get a worse case if you get it from somebody who had a more severe case. Definitely. Yeah. But Morristown is interesting because he did a lot of outreach because he knew it was going to spread, and he the preachers were and having, the
Yeah. That vaccinate after
not well.
Sick if it's somebody else, because you have enough immunities that you'll get them that part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was not a clear science. Sure. Yeah.
We have a question online.
Yes.
Here. Someone asked, do records from the period indicate knowledge of cross immunity from cowpox?
Cowpox was not understood until Jenner, 1799. He discovered that connection. So at this time, no, I've never read anything about somebody saying, oh, what about cowpox? No, it was Jenner who noticed that cow maids just didn't get smallpox, and he put together, oh, they already have the pox on their head, that's something else, it's cowpox. And that's when he developed the vaccine. And you may know, but I'll just clarify. So an inoculation is giving yourself a live virus and making yourself sick. A vaccination is yourself an injection with a dead virus that will only produce immunity, not make you sick. So that's why the cowpox and a vaccine was so important. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did anybody like Washington or its officers attribute the very high desertion rate American armies to not just walk away from smallpox?
Well, there was a lot of reasons to get away from the army, right? food, no money, no clothes, but smallpox, absolutely. He was very concerned about and retention. Yeah, and it definitely impacted it. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, I typed in that Franklin's inoculation to follow up, and it does say in 1736, Benjamin Franklin lost his son, Francis Folger Franklin.
Yep.
To smallpox. Franklin regretted not inoculating him because the boy was sick at his time.
Yep.
Now, going back, the Franklin Brothers Boston newspaper was critical of smallpox inoculation in 1721. And they think they were anonymous, the sign up through the letters. So it is attributed to be fine. If not, then it was the Franklin Brothers. And
Well, his brother was the editor. Franklin at that time was just a young guy writing and didn't get along with his brother anyway.
he became a small inoculation in the 1730s by variant nation.
Yep. That's the same as inoculation, yeah.
Well, there's articles from the NCBI National Institute of Health making the right decision that the Franklin's smallpox .com had an article. It's all from the went after COVID. Forbes.com, Franklin mentioned anti-vaccine.
I don't know, because I don't think he was in charge of the newspaper. I mean, anything that I've ever read, you know, was that his brother was in charge and he didn't get along with him and he ran away. He ran away from his brother. So, and he was so young. It was very controversial though. 1721, it was a new thing. It was controversial and, you know, people were afraid. And there were Douglas was adamantly against it. He changed his mind too.
But in the books and the biographies, it talks about the smallpox thing. So I would have to research Franklin's autobiography, the standard.
Isaacson, yeah. Yeah, I've never been able to find out. I don't think Benjamin Franklin was ever inoculated. He never wrote about it. He never said it. I assume because he grew up in Boston. Again, he probably maybe got it in an earlier epidemic and survived and just never mentioned it. Because I've asked a few people and I've never found any mention that he said I was inoculated. So I don't know how he was immune, but I assume he was.
I got chicken pox when I started graduate school.
Oof.
And at the same time as my 3-year-old niece. And I understand maybe, I don't know, but apparently the older you are, the more dangerous it is. And with some of these things, you become sterile.
Yep.
But I have people, so at least I think
No, it is documented that smallpox, like I think mumps is another one that can cause infertility in men. Yes.
So reading the primary sources, is there, you can, know for sure, there's so many diseases going around, dysentery, typhus, like, when they say camp fever,
Yep.
is that like one of the others, or?
That's something else.
Yeah.
That was a problem when I really first started my kind of wrestled with it because it's smallpox, but there's other diseases too. Obviously, there's a lot of illness in camps. So it was probably both happening at the same time, but my research really just the number of times they credit smallpox and they said I had smallpox, I was inoculated for smallpox because everybody was getting smallpox. It's clear that that was a big issue. It's not the only issue, but it was more of an issue, at least to my mind, than you usually read in a Revolutionary War, book.
Was definitely more rare. But you never read about the birth. The closest means that areas wouldn't call that. You'll read about consumption.
Right.
Well, consumption.
That's right.
And that came.
Right. Yes.
Rather close quarters, not necessarily.
Well, that to me is kind of the interesting thing. Smallpox, because this is before the jury, before anybody washed their hands, and then so they cut off limbs and so on. they knew smallpox. They could recognize smallpox. They knew what it looked like. They knew what it felt like. And so I trust the, people attesting to the fact that I had smallpox or this person had smallpox. The other things, you're right, the humors and this, and they don't know what it is and the different. I've never seen smallpox called anything else but smallpox. I don't know what you're talking. But I'm happy to keep going. I have one more back there. Okay, good. Okay.
If I may, my son comes with second master's in history from his college. And he was telling me, because I was talking about this topic, I wanted to invite him to come, my 26-year-old daughter, he declined, obviously because of my company. Anyhow, he said that World War II was the only war, the first war where people died on the battlefield more than sicknesses. And so all through American history, world history, more people died of disease than.
Yep, that's absolutely true. Yep.
My grandfather was a medical officer on the USS Wyatt in World War I. He was going around treating yellow fever and ribbon.
Yep. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so I was trying to find before I read this, to read the primary sources, I was interested in hearing about what George Washington was talking about with Martha, because I had read that especially in New Jersey winter camp, that Martha played a huge role in health and inoculating the troops. So I was wondering if you saw talk about that.
I don't think she would have been anywhere near any inoculation. She would probably take care of them after, once she herself was immune. But he had medical staff, they had medical staff doing it hospital. But once he decided to do it, it was a medical procedure. You had to go into the hospital. You had to, be there for 3 weeks and so on. Yes, Martha was. Him for almost all, I think every winter quarter, and obviously supportive of him and helped him. And I, yes, have read a lot about how she was good to the troops and they liked her, and she took care of them and I guess tried to get them provisions or whatever, as much as she could possibly do. Never read anything about her really doing too much of the nursing, or it was more, she was there for George, I think, more than anything else. And he probably needed it too.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right. Have you ever speculated about the psychological effects of smallpox and disease in these revolutionary times? So I think the parallel is that after COVID, people became more fearful, skittish, paranoid, no sense of humor, and obviously, kind of like their imaginations have gone. People become very literal and they don't know the subtlety. In general, but a lot of people wants the subtlety of life.
I haven't read anything about that, but I know that they were afraid of smallpox way beyond, way beyond anything else. It was a fearsome, horrible disease that they knew. I don't think I mentioned the mortality rate could be up to 50%. If it was a significant, bad situation. If you had any other physical, problems, of course, you were more, weakened by it. Children, adults, every age, it just struck fast and it struck hard, and people were really worried about getting smallpox. Yes.
Well, to this question, I did read it was so sick that we would take wax and try to fill a hole in their face.
Yep.
And they did it. Fire.
People, yeah,
So
no, it's,
it was
yes,
devastating.
it's horrible. Yes,
Figures.
exactly. People could go blind. People would commit suicide because they were so horribly disfigured, Yes, you're absolutely right. That was part of the fear. It's not just I might die if I get it. It's like, oh my God, if I survive, what am I going to be able to get married? What am I going to look like? I can't look at myself in the mirror. It was really frightening. It was really a frightening scenario.
Washington saw that.
A few. Yep.
You never see it in the papers.
They cut Sure,
Yeah,
yeah,
well, thank God they recorded it, because having.
yeah. My husband likes to say, and he never had children, so if he had children, I said, I don't think so, I don't think so. You mean to mask in case they got, no, not that they didn't know about germs, right? They didn't know. And I don't think it would have helped for smallpox anyway, because it's just, you touch something, 2 weeks, a week after somebody's in the bed with smallpox, you could catch it that way. So, but I never heard of anybody attempting isolation, quarantine, and, put them in the hospital. That was about it. Stay away from people.
I think we can end on that.
Oh.
Yes.
She had one more. Go ahead.
I think she was tenth grade, so.
Oh.
But, we touched on it slightly, but I learned so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Our next lecture is on June 19th. It will be on the history of the Bethel AME Church and the history of the Hobbs Farm. So that'll be here June 19th. You get our emails. We'll let you know when you can register. Everyone at home. Good night.